Good evening, good morning, or good afternoon. My name is Maddison McKibbin, and there is a lot going on in the Olympic race in beach volleyball, and you need to know about it right now. Who's going to the Olympics? Is there still hope, or have the teams been decided? Is Kerri gonna finally pass the torch on to the youngsters, or hold on for one more medal? Are Jake and Taylor on the cusp of not qualifying? And also, there's so many other international teams that you should be watching in these last two tournaments before the Olympic bids are finally sealed. And we're gonna cover all of that right now. So why are we even doing this? For one, this Olympic race is extremely close for a lot of teams. Olympic dreams are on the line. Legacies are on the line. This is one of the most dramatic periods of our sport in the last 5 years. Yet, because we know the qualification process is a little bit complicated, and there's not many beach volleyball media analysts out there covering our sport, nobody really understands the gravity of this Olympic race. Which brings us to, we are partnering with Microsoft 365. Microsoft 365 offers a ton of different applications, but they saw what we were doing with these Olympic updates and they wanted to help us with our mission. We strongly believe that stats tell stories in sports, and we've been using Microsoft Excel to help craft these stories. You know, stats on their own are just arbitrary numbers. Without any context, they just sit in the record books collecting dust. But if you've been following this Olympic race for an embarrassing amount of time, like I have, diligently tracking the progress of each and every team, meticulously collecting data, utilizing an absurd amount of Excel spreadsheets, we've been able to aggregate and synthesize these stats to help identify trends and bring to life the epic stories happening right now in our sport. All right, let's be real. We're not data scientists. We're not running sophisticated analytical analyses using Excel. We're professional beach volleyball players that make YouTube videos. But we believe that if fans have a better grasp of what's at stake, how the finishes in Cancun possibly affected these teams' Olympic dreams going into the last two tournaments before the qualification ends, will provide a much more exhilarating viewing experience for you, the fan. So when you think about it, who would have thought Microsoft Excel was such a masterful storytelling tool? Let's start off with the US men. Prior to the Cancun Mortal Kombat of beach volleyball, 3 tournaments in 17 days, Jake and Taylor were the #1 team for the US by a pretty large margin. But guess what? They're tied for 9th. By who? They're tied for 9th with Nick and Phil. Nick and Phil caught up to Jake and Taylor, and they're tied. Did I say that already? Prior to this Mortal Kombat of beach volleyball, it seemed pretty clear that Nick and Phil and Trevor were gonna fight off for that 2nd place spot. And Trevor were only behind Nick and Phil by 40 points. Now that's not the case. Now and Trevor are going up against both the US teams and nobody is safe from elimination. But you might be asking, are and Trevor still in it? Do they have any hope? Before I get into that, I want to say first off, good news for the US. We are officially going to have 2 men's teams representing the USA in the Olympics. And as it stands right now, will be Jake and Taylor, Phil and Nick, because they're tied for 9th. However, I wouldn't count out and Trevor. So there's 2 tournaments left. And for and Trevor to remain in the race, they need a bare minimum 5th place finish in this upcoming tournament in Sochi, Russia. In other words, if the other USA teams don't even play in this tournament and Trevor don't get a 5th, they will be eliminated from this race. Kaput. They're out. But they do have hope, and here's why. For starters, they're automatically into the main draw for Sochi. No country quota, no qualifier, no extra matches before the main draw. Point number 2. In the 2nd Cancun tournament, they played in the country quota and the qualifier, 3 extra matches, 7 extra sets in some grueling conditions and still pulled off a 9th. So imagine what they could do not having to play in those. And in the 3rd Cancun tournament, they got a 5th, so it's all within their wheelhouse. Furthermore, through statistical analysis using Microsoft Excel, encompassing all 3 Cancun tournaments, the average seed of the teams that Nick and Phil beat was 17th. The average seed that Taylor and Jake beat was 17th. The average seed of the teams that and Trevor beat was 6th. Troy and Trevor played 8 matches against teams seeded 10th or higher. That's more than any other US men's team played. And their record against them, they went 5-3. That's a 63% winning percentage. And those wins came against the 6th seed twice, the 4th seed once, and the 2nd seeds twice. Crazy. Now, I wish I could give you the odds or the chances that they get a 5th place in this upcoming tournament. But what I do know is they don't have to play 7 extra sets before getting into the main draw. I do know that they got a 5th in the last tournament and that they can hold their own against the top 10 teams in the world. So I wouldn't count them out, and neither should you. Now moving on to the US women. Before Cancun, April and Alix were #1 in the world and remain #1 in the world, so they're good. But where the real story is what's happening below them. For starters, Kelly Claes and Sarah Sponcil are out of the country quota, they're out of the qualifier, and they've actually traded places with Kerri and Brook. Kerri and Brook now find themselves in the country quota. You might be wondering, how is that even possible? Well, qualifying for the main draw is based upon entry points, and I'll keep this as fast as I can. Entry points are your best 4 finishes out of your last 6 tournaments. So Sponcil and Claes barely eked out Kerri and Brook by 100 points, 100 entry points, to get into the main draw and send Kerri and Brook into the country quota. But remember, Kerri and Brook are still the 2nd place team for the US, with Sarah Sponcil and Kelly Claes extremely close behind them. So needless to say, this is a race, this is a rivalry that you need to follow. They were 240 points behind Kerri, and they've closed that gap to 160. With 2 tournaments left, there's a few different scenarios of how Sponcil and Claes could leapfrog Kerri and Brook, but the most direct way would be to make a final in either tournament. Assuming Kerri and Brook don't make it to a semis in either of the tournaments, if Sponcil and Claes make it to 1 final, they will have passed Kerri and Brook and claimed that 2nd spot for the US. And you might be asking yourself, how likely is it that they make a final? Okay, for starters, they've made the finals twice in 2 4-star FIVB events, so they've already done that. In the 3rd Cancun tournament, they beat the #1 seeded team in the tournament and narrowly lost to the 2nd ranked team in the world in 3. Outside of making it to the podium in Sochi, getting a 4th will help them in their Olympic provisional rankings. Anything less won't help them, but it also won't knock them out of the Olympic race for 2nd. So the question is, what is this team capable of doing without having to play in the country quotas or the qualifiers? However, there are some crucial close battles happening between other countries and within other countries for a better Olympic seed, or even more importantly, just an Olympic bid. The first one, the battle between the Latvians and the Polish. Smoilovs and Smedins versus Kantor and Losiak. So right now, the Latvians currently sit in the 15th spot, the last spot of the Olympic provisional rankings. And yes, you guessed it, the Polish team sits in 16th, just outside of that Olympic bid. In the 3rd Cancun tournament, the Latvians were actually eliminated by Kantor and Losiak, giving them a 9th. Kantor and Losiak going on to get a 5th, closing the margin between those 2 teams to 100 points. So look for these teams to both get a 5th or higher, which could mix up that spot of who's 15th and who's 16th. Okay, now on to the women. Outside of the US battle for that 2nd spot in the Olympic provisional rankings, the women's side is relatively set. But there are 2 countries that you should keep an eye out for. The 2 German teams and the 2 Swiss teams. Even though the #1 teams for both countries have a higher Olympic provisional rankings, when it comes to entry points, both the 2nd place German teams have higher entry points than the #1 seeded teams for their country. So meaning they're kind of heating up. Their last 6 tournaments were better than the #1 seeded team. So they have a chance of possibly switching positions, though both countries and both teams will probably be in the Olympics. There might be a switch of who would be the #1 team or the #2 team for the Swiss and the Germans. For many teams, this race is kind of like that carnival horse race game where you have the balls, you have to roll it up into the holes, but all these teams aren't vying for the holes in the front. Everyone is going for the long shot, the one that's going to move the horse the furthest. because that's where we are in this crucial race. It's only 2 tournaments left. They need the highest finishes they can. So look for these people to be sitting down at the carnival games, rolling it all the way, trying to get to the top. No one's shooting for the short shots. I don't know if that analogy made literally any sense. It did to me, but that's the Olympic update. And I want to say thank you to Microsoft 365 for helping us do what we do.